Hi, my name is Carol Williams, and I'm here with you on CAN TV on Thursday night. This is the Veterans Issues Rotation. We're happy to have you here tonight. This is a live call-in hotline show. If you want to call in and have a comment on what we're talking about on this show, the number is right there on your screen. It's 312-738-1060. You can call in and talk to us about the content of what we're talking about tonight. The organization that I'm talking about is United States Veterans Arts Program. This is a small nonprofit organization that the mission is to increase the representation of veterans in the arts community. And we try to support veteran artists in several different ways, one of which is to get here on CAN TV and tell you about some veteran artists in Chicago area. Another way that we do that is to create and produce events that we use as an opportunity to donate artistic tools to veterans who are looking for ways to express themselves and have visions, but perhaps not the physical resources to do that. We have a website that we'd like to give you, that if you'd like to get in touch with us to either fill out an application for an artistic tool, or if you'd like to ask us any other questions, that would be great. And we are going to start off tonight with a guest as soon as I show you our website. You can get in touch with us here at www.usvap.org. The email is admin@usvap.org. We're going to be talking tonight to a veteran, a writer, and a college professor. His name is Tom Nawrocki. He is here with us tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about what Tom does. He's going to give us an idea of what he has written. He's going to read an essay that he has had published about Vietnam. Tom is a Vietnam-era veteran. He is someone who has a lot of interesting things to tell us about not just his experience in Japan in the Marines as an air traffic controller, as a Chicagoan, as a writer, as an essayist, but also someone who has visited Vietnam multiple times. He has done literary works about Vietnam. And he is very interested in giving you some of his experiences and some of his perspectives. Very personal things that Tom has to talk about and write about. Also to tell you about how it is that he has done what he's done. But let's turn it over to Tom. He's going to tell you a little bit about himself and where he came from and what he's doing.
Sure. I grew up on the southwest side of Chicago, went to Fenwick High School, graduated in 1965, didn't have the money to go to college. My father was a blue-collar worker, so what I really needed was the GI Bill. This was 1965, the war was heating up, and I knew that, and I wanted the experience, to be honest, so I volunteered.
Mm-hmm.
And I volunteered to go in for 4 years, and they made me eventually made me an air traffic controller. I actually volunteered to go to Vietnam twice, but when you're an air traffic controller, they don't move you around very much. Mm-hmm. So I was in North Carolina and waited for orders. Orders finally arrived in 1969. Mm-hmm. I had orders to go to Da Nang, but I got held up in Okinawa because they scheduled a pullback.
Right.
And there were about 100,000 of us that got held up in Okinawa, mm-hmm. and then they dispersed us around Southeast Asia. Mm-hmm. I got sent to Iwakuni, Japan, where I spent my last year in the Marine Corps, essentially waiting.
Kind of waiting, in waiting mode.
Yeah, so it's interesting that I'm not a Vietnam veteran. I didn't serve. I didn't see combat. I'm Vietnam era.
And right. And one of the things that we talked about is that there's not really a caste system for veterans. That some veterans are more deserving of attention and of respect and of honor because they were or were not in a combat area. There's veterans who are combat veterans, yes, and then there are non-combatants. There are veterans like me who our veterans that were certainly in a zone of safety. But when you say that you were a Vietnam era veteran, you actually had a cousin in Vietnam who you corresponded with, and it's not like you were sitting in Japan basically not being connected to the events that were transpiring. From what you tell me, just being in waiting mode and thinking that you were going to go to Cambodia and Laos is very stressful. It
Right. We knew that
fearful.
There were plans to invade Cambodia, and actually that began to happen. In Iwakuni, Japan, we were getting new equipment in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps is part of the Navy.
It's the men's department of the Navy.
The Marine Corps gets all the used equipment. The only time you see new equipment arriving in boxes is when you know you're going to be deployed somewhere. So we were pretty sure we were going into Cambodia, but before that happened, Congress found out and prevented the full invasion from happening. My connection to the war is Bobby was my cousin. He enlisted after me. He was a year younger than me. He was in the Marine Corps. He was a radio man, and he was killed in the Tet Offensive. So there is one Nawrocki on the wall.
Oh, wow.
It's the only, out of the 56,000 names, there's one Nawrocki. It's Bobby. So I've had that connection all my life with Vietnam veterans who I understand, and although I didn't participate like they did, I certainly in country. I certainly am an ally of them and help whenever I can, and I've written about it too. So
a lot of your literature and your involvement has been about Vietnam. Certainly, as it has touched you. And for a lot of people, it touched them in any number of ways, whether they were stateside, whether they were civilians. It's been a traumatic divide and a traumatic experience for most Americans. And you have something to read to us before we even get to that point. We would like to take a call. Someone who is calling the show, hopefully to ask a question about the topic of what we're talking about. Would you like to go ahead, caller?
Is that me?
Yes.
There's an art gallery, Vietnam Veterans Art Gallery on Wabash, and I think it is over there. I don't
It's
know.
on Indiana. 18th and Indiana?
Yeah, right. And, some of this stuff is quite stunning.
Yes.
And I was wondering, why has there never been any attempt to integrate that into a larger scale, like a New York Soho kind of presentation with little recording things and all that sort of stuff?
Well, I think they have had some projects with recording. That building, that art gallery started off being all 3 floors, you know that. And within the last couple of years, they've consolidated it to the 3rd floor.
yes.
Still worthwhile to go in and see, unbelievably poignant, and the works of art in there are among some of my favorites, particularly...
Just for the record, though, it's 58,000 guys on the wall.
I'm sorry. You're right.
I think they have amended that number in the last several years, unfortunately.
Well, there's people that are adding every day because of, wartime injuries that they finally die from. Well, thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for calling. Thank you so very much. Tom, you're teaching writing at Columbia College English Department. And how did you go from being getting out of the Marine Corps, using your GI Bill, to being a professor with a master's degree at Columbia College in Chicago, teaching people how to express themselves through writing?
Well, when I came out of the Marine Corps, I was interested in the arts and in writing in particular. So I started taking some college courses and quickly found out that it was too expensive. And when you were applying for the GI Bill, there was a delay. So sometimes you would get in, but you wouldn't get a check for as long as a year. So I kind of bounced in and out of school and then started carrying mail so I could save up money. I carried mail in Oak Park for 2.5 years and saved money to go down to SIU
Oh.
and used the Veteran Scholarship and the GI Bill. So I went to school down there first.
So you use the Illinois Veterans Scholarship
Yes.
plus the GI Bill. For
Yes.
those of you who don't know, the Illinois Veterans Scholarship is still extraordinarily usable, easy, and accessible. So if you haven't checked it out as a veteran who came in from Illinois and got out of the service and went back to Illinois, check it out because it's extraordinarily easy to use at any of the state schools.
Absolutely.
So go ahead.
Absolutely. So when I was at SIU, my writing was I was encouraged to continue writing, but also most writers wind up teaching because it's really hard to make a living as a poet or writer.
Right.
And I started tutoring. I seemed to be fairly good at it, and I was encouraged to take some education courses. I went up to Loyola, got my master's, and was hired at Columbia College in 1977, first part-time, and then adjunct faculty, and then I went full-time in 1985. So I've actually been at Columbia for 34 years.
And one of the classes that you taught there was literature of the Vietnam War.
Yes, I'll be teaching. I just finished the class in the fall semester, the literature of the Vietnam War, and starting in 2 weeks, I'll be team teaching with Dominic Pasiga, a pretty well-known Chicago historian. We team teach, of course, the Vietnam War in history, literature, and art. And I will say that these courses are very popular. Students, our classes always fill up immediately, and it's a joy to teach because the students are really interested. They really don't get much of the history of the war or even the literature of the war in high school because it's still controversial.
Right, right.
So they're ready to hear and really interested in what we have to show them.
We do have another caller. Caller, are you interested in asking Tom a question about what we're talking about tonight?
Yeah, thank you for taking my call.
Great.
I just wanted to ask, now when you got the Veterans Scholarship, was there a stipulation that you tried to focus your art on veterans' issues? Or is it just something that, as a veteran, you had the opportunity to apply for?
Yeah, all veterans have the opportunity, and you don't have to stipulate what your major is going to be. It's the kind of thing that you develop as you progress in your student career. So because I was a veteran, I was always interested in that, and it just kind of grew on me. But I didn't proclaim it immediately. It grew on me through the years.
So if you're a veteran and you're calling about Veteran Scholarship, I hope that you go ahead and do your paperwork and apply, and we'd love to see you get out there and do what you want to do. We're going to talk about Tom Nawrocki's work that he's going to talk to us about, and at the time that he calls us, we're going to let him read an essay. It'll take just about 5 minutes. He's going to give us a little bit of information about it first. And we have a couple of overheads that are going to describe what it is that he's talking about. Tom, tell us a little bit about the image that you have here that goes along with your story.
Actually, this is what I'm writing about. I was fortunate to be able to go to Vietnam in 2003 in April, and this is in a small scenic village named Hoi An in the middle of the country, and we just happened to walk by these young men who were working. This is their job. What they're actually working with is barbed wire, and at the top of the screen there is a young man with a pair of pliers who's untwisting the barbs from the barbed wire, and then the wire is then stretched down, and somebody's putting a chemical solution on it to take the rust off, and then they create fish baskets, which they use to either carry things or trap fish. And if you go to this, he's actually assembling, he's weaving a basket, and you can see the baskets behind him. They're really, really good at this. But what struck me when I realized what I had walked past and looked at was barbed wire that probably surrounded an American fire base at one point in Vietnam. And here they were using this stuff to productive in
Right.
their lives.
Right, in a most peaceful fashion. If you weren't a fish, I suppose you would find it very peaceful.
That's true.
We do have a call that we're going to take before we start reading. And caller, did you have a question for either one of us about the topic that we're talking about?
Sure. I wanted to know, are there opportunities in the military if you are interested in writing?
Good question. Excellent question. There are journalists in the Army and in the military. There's photographers. Last month we had a show with a combat artist, although they don't really have painters anymore. I myself was in the band when I was in the Army. So there are a lot of things that you can do in the military that may be something that you've already pursued or that you would like to pursue that are not particularly military-like when you look at it on the face. So yes, the military does have journalists. I don't know how you would qualify to do that. There are people who join the military as linguists. Some of it you get trained on the job. Probably for a job like that, you'd need quite a bit of background, I would think, with writing and journalism. But certainly, I would love to see you pursue that. That would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to now talk, have Tom read an essay that he wrote about this picture that we talked about, and this is called Untwisting Barbs. It appeared in the Michigan Quarterly Review on an issue called Vietnam Issues Winter 2005 from the Michigan Quarterly Review. And this is Tom Nawrocki reading from his own work.
Vietnam. It's an amazing country today, poor but culturally rich, primitive economically, but in most other ways complex beyond concise explanation. If you go there, expect small moments ripe with poetic meaning. For example, it's April 2003, and I'm walking down Tri Phu Street in the river village of Hoi An, just south of Da Nang, near the middle of the country. It's a pleasant morning before the humidity and the heat begin to wilt your clothes, and the light seems golden, reflecting off the Tu Bon River. Hoi An is a quaint historic town dating back to 500 AD, when Chinese and Japanese vessels would sail a mile inland from the South China Sea to establish trade. The buildings next to the river are historic, some dating back to the 17th century. Never more than 2 stories tall, the narrow structures are Chinese or Japanese in nature. Buddhist temples blend in with storefronts selling brightly colored silk lanterns. The streets are narrow, and cars are not allowed in this section. The traffic is entirely bikes and pedestrians. I'm walking just outside the busy market area where meat, fish, and produce are being sold for today's meals. I will save in my memory what I observe as I look to my right. 3 working men in shorts, loose summer shirts, and faded baseball caps are squatting on their haunches, laboring with intense concentration in the shadow of a wall. Their heads are bent down as they use both hands to turn, bend, and weave long strands of silver wire into fish trap baskets. But the man I mentally photograph is the last one I pass. He's probably the youngest of the 3. He has 20 feet of wire stretched straight out away from him, and it's rusty and battered and barbed. With a pair of pliers, he is untwisting the barbs from the wire until each one falls off into a pile of rusted barbs at his feet. He must have a 5-inch stack of barbs already this morning, and a good 12 feet of stripped wire coiling to his other side. When he is done, the next man will chemically clean the smooth wire coil, and voila, fish trap wire. I have to think this wire came from the United States and protected some American fire base at one point during what the Vietnamese refer to as the American War. It's been 30 years since American forces left Vietnam, but the untwisting still continues. I'm still thinking about that image as a young teenager with a long pole over his shoulder walks towards me. We move toward each other with loping strides. We make eye contact for a lingering second, and we both smile slightly and nod hello and pass less than a foot apart. And just as he disappears from the corner of my eye, I hear in English, "Sorry for New York." My head snaps around, and I see him still walking, not looking back. I yell, "Thank you!" Without looking back, he extends one hand to wave while still heading off to work down the Two Bawn River. And I can remember that moment vividly, and what he's saying, sorry for New York, sorry for 9/11. And here it was, a few minutes before, I had seen the untwisting of the barbs, and it seemed like here's a different kind of barb that was being untwisted for me at that moment. And here's a teenage Vietnamese young man. I was stunned and delighted, actually, and still am. So when I have gone to Vietnam, what I really appreciate is the fact that the Vietnamese don't seem to resent us. And you've been there too, right?
Yes.
It amazes me how welcoming they are. And in fact, when I say that I was in Vietnam, when I've met people, other writers, and I've said I wasn't in the war, I was on Vietnam era,
Mm-hmm.
they say it would be okay. You can tell us the truth. So it's unusual, but it's a delightful experience to be there.
So the barbed wire represented, the barbs in the barbed wire represented the extreme hostility that not just the war zone itself produced, but also the emotional impact that has lasted really up until today in our country.
Absolutely.
And for you to see someone physically taking apart something that is so painful to people would be nice to be able to take a pair of pliers and do the same with our hearts and minds.
Absolutely. And I think by traveling to Vietnam, and I'm not the only one, my friend, the Vietnam veteran writer Larry Heineman, who won the National Book Award
Mm-hmm.
in 1987, is actually in Vietnam right now. The Writers Union is translating his novel Paco Story into Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first American Vietnam veteran novel to be fully translated into Vietnamese. And by doing this, I think it's an emotional untwisting that Larry certainly appreciates, and I think the Vietnamese do too.
Well, an analogous situation happened to my husband, Kimo, who is a Vietnam veteran, but when he was actually in Ho Chi Minh City on 9/11, along with several other people from Columbia College, performing his symphony. And people were stopping him on the street because they could see that he was an American, and this was on 9/11, and offering their condolences to him. Later in the evening, during the performance of his symphony, they actually had a moment of silence for this horrible tragedy. Not a lot of people would expect that out of a foreign, a former enemy, who you would assume that they would love to see us suffer the same way that they suffered. But that's not necessarily the case in Vietnam and with Vietnamese. And of course, their population is very young, and they don't necessarily worship history anymore. And maybe it's easier for them in some very strange ways. But Tom Nawrocki from Columbia College, he has a email address that I'd like to put up in our last few minutes here. If you would like to get in touch with Tom Nawrocki, he has many ideas of things that are interesting and wonderful to do. If you're a veteran and you'd like to use some kind of writing to express yourself, he does teach at Columbia College. This is the website for our nonprofit that we are representing today, usvap.org. We will be here next month, and until then, thank you very much for calling in, and visit our website, please. Thank you very much.